Hey there. Grab a cup of coffee and get comfortable. Remember when people used to call others tree huggers like it was some kind of insult? Honestly, I never got that. Trees are pretty amazing. Without them, we wouldn't have fresh air or these paper cups we sip from. I'd probably hug one myself if I had the time. Speaking of trees, you're definitely going to want something to hold on to after hearing today's stories. These are unsettling encounters straight from the logging camps, the kind that might just make you think twice before wandering too far into the woods.
Story 1.
Experiences from Tim the Logman. I'll be changing the names in the story for obvious reasons. My company is pretty serious about confidentiality, and honestly, some of the guys still don't like talking about what happened. After this story, I do have a quick other one to tell as well, but this first one took place one winter during a logging contract in northern British Columbia. I've been logging for a while now. I've seen plenty of weird stuff in the woods, but nothing quite like this first story. You can call me Jacob. I was working with a crew of 4. There was Mitch, the big guy from Vancouver who'd been logging almost as long as me, but thought everything supernatural was complete bullcrap. There was Luis, our greenhorn. His first real logging job was this, eager to prove himself but still learning the ropes. Then there was Old Man Riley, must have been logging for years at least. One of those old-timers who knew about every superstition and folklore tale in the business. This contract was for a pretty remote area, hours from the nearest real town. We were staying at this little camp set up specifically for the job. Just some trailers and basic amenities, nothing fancy. The whole thing was supposed to take about months. It started our very first night there. We had driven up that afternoon, stopping at this diner in the last town before the logging road. The kind of place that looks like it hasn't changed since. We were enjoying coffee, getting something to eat before heading to the site, when this local guy at the counter started to chat with us. It was typical stuff, asking about the contract, where we were from, that sort of thing. But then when we told him where we'd be going, he got real serious and asked if we knew about the hide behind. Mitch rolled his eyes right away. He had heard all the old logger folklore before, but this guy wasn't telling it like a campfire story. He said there had been sightings in that area quite recently. It was described as something tall and thin that you never saw directly. You would just glimpse movements of it before it hid behind a tree, which is why it was called a hide behind. He said his cousin, who worked road maintenance, had seen one last month standing behind a pine tree that wasn't nearly wide enough to hide anything that size. Old Man Riley was nodding the whole time, real solemn-like too, but Luis was just confused. They don't have hide-behind stories where he's from. I'd heard about them, sure, but like most loggers, I figured they were just stories meant to keep people who worked with dangerous equipment alert in the woods. Our first week on the site was normal enough. We got into our routine, started to make good progress in the contract. Then there were little things that happened. Our tools would go missing, showing up in places they had not been placed. Like a chainsaw file, which we'd all been looking for, but it suddenly appeared balanced on a stump yard into the uncut section. There were also these feelings while we worked, like someone was standing right behind us. You'd turn around, and there'd be nothing there, but then you'd catch a flash of movement just at the edge of your vision. Mitch would tell us it's just nerves. Our minds can play tricks on us because of that guy's story at the diner and being in a new area of woods. Luis wasn't sure about that. He began to carry a little medallion that his grandmother had given him for protection. Riley didn't say much, but I noticed he started doing this thing every morning where he would walk the perimeter of the work area muttering something under his breath. About weeks in, the weird stuff started getting more obvious. We'd find these marks on trees. I wouldn't call them claw marks exactly, but long vertical grooves that none of us could explain. They'd show up overnight on trees that we hadn't yet cut, always in groups of 4 or 5. Mitch tried to say it was bears passing through. I've seen bear marks myself, though, and those weren't it. After that, we started to hear things while we worked. Not normal forest sounds, mind you. This was like, well, you know when you're in a public place and someone's having a conversation just quiet enough that you can't make out the words? It was like that, but there was never anyone around besides us. It would follow us too, around the site, always seeming to come from just behind whatever tree was nearby. Old Man Riley started leaving little offerings too then, at the edge of the clearing, bits of his lunch, shiny objects he had found. When Luis asked him about it, he said something like, "Sometimes it's better to share what you have than lose what you need." Mitch said it was ridiculous. However, none of us noticed him working alone anymore. Even the biggest, toughest skeptic gets cautious when things get weird. The incidents kept escalating. One morning, we found the chainsaws just tossed in a pile in the middle of the camp, each and every one of them, even though we had locked them in the equipment trailer the night before, and the locks on that trailer weren't even broken. They were still locked somehow. So how were the chainsaws outside? Another time, Luis swore something grabbed his shoulder while he was marking trees. He spun around and there was nothing there. But when he checked, there were 4 long bruises on his shoulder, like someone with huge hands had grabbed hold of him too hard. But the elk head, that's what finally got to all of us. It was about a month into the contract. We showed up at the site one morning, and there was this fresh elk head mounted on a pole at the entrance to the camp. It wasn't like a hunter's kill either. This thing had been torn or ripped off, not cut. There was flesh and fur attached still, totally mangled, but the head itself was positioned deliberately, facing the camp entrance like some kind of disturbing warning. Mitch didn't have any smart comments about that one. We called the local wildlife officer, but by the time he got there, the head was gone. It had just vanished, pole and all. The officer found some tracks around where it had been, but they didn't make any sense. It looked like something with 2 legs, but a stride twice the length of a human's. That's when Old Man Riley finally told us what he knew about hide-behinds. He said they weren't just logger folklore. They were territorial spirits that attached themselves to certain parts of the forest. Usually they would just play tricks, try to spook people away from their territory. But sometimes, if they felt threatened or disrespected, they could get aggressive. That elk head was a message. This was its territory, and we were not welcome here. Riley said he'd seen something similar back in the 70s on a job in northern Ontario. Their crew had ignored the signs and kept working. 3 men disappeared over the course of a week. They found one of them 2 days later wandering in circles, completely incoherent. That one never worked in the woods again. But the other 2 were never found. Now take that story with a grain of salt. I was not able to verify it. Probably just some old logger legends. But after what we'd seen, well, who really knew? We had a crew meeting that night to decide what to do. The contract was worth good money, but we were all on edge. Luis wanted to leave right away. Mitch, for all his skepticism, didn't argue. I was torn. I had never left a job unfinished before. Old Man Riley just sat there quietly until we asked his opinion. "There's old agreements," he said finally. "Old ways of dealing with such things. But they take time and respect and knowledge I don't rightly have. But we can stay and try to make peace with it. Maybe succeed, maybe not. Or we can admit this piece of forest isn't meant for logging, not now anyway." The next morning we called the company up, told them we were pulling out. We made up a story about equipment issues and activists or pranksters messing with equipment. In a way, it wasn't entirely untruthful. The company, of course, was not happy, but they eventually agreed to terminate the contract without penalties. Better to lose some money than some people. As we packed up to leave, I swear I saw something, just for a split second behind a huge old cedar, a tall and thin figure, maybe 8 feet high but narrow as a fence post. It moved in a way nothing should be able to move, like it was flowing around the tree rather than walking. I only caught a glimpse before it was gone, but that was enough. Old Man Riley saw me looking too. He walked over to the cedar, pulled out his lunch bag, and left half his sandwich and a couple cookies at the base. "For the road," he said quietly. "Best to part on good terms." We drove out of there fast as we safely could. The company ended up sending another crew in the spring. They made it a few days before they also walked off the job. Nobody would say exactly why, but I heard they found their equipment arranged in certain ways each morning, no matter how they secured it the night before. As far as I know, that section of forest is still unlogged. The company eventually wrote it off as an environmental protection area. Easier to say that than admit there was something in there that didn't want us there. I'm still a logger, but I pay more attention now to the signs. Sometimes the trees themselves aren't the only things you need to worry about in this job. Luis quit logging altogether, moved back to the city. Mitch is still logging too, but he doesn't laugh at folklore anymore. Riley retired last year, though he still does consulting work for various logging companies. Word has it they don't just call him for his technical expertise, but also because he can check new sites and give them his feelings about them. As for me, I keep working. I've developed some habits of my own. I leave a little something at the edge of every new cut site, usually a granola bar, Maybe some trail mix. Probably looks silly to the younger guys, but better safe than sorry. And I never ever work alone anymore, because sometimes when I'm out there and the shadows are long, I still get that feeling of something standing right behind me. Sometimes I hear what sounds like whispering, just quiet enough that I can't quite make out the words. Now, that wouldn't be my last strange experience in the woods, though. About months after the hide-behind incident, I was on a contract up in northern Minnesota. This was good money, too, and I figured whatever territorial spirits might be up there, they couldn't be worse than what we dealt with in BC. Shows what I know. The job was straightforward, clearing a section of old growth that had been approved for selective cutting. This time it was me and 4 other guys, all locals except for this one guy from Wisconsin. Right from the start, they were weird about certain parts of those woods. There was a section, maybe acres, that they absolutely refused to enter after about 5 p.m. Said it was crying time. I thought they were pranking me, seriously trying to haze the out-of-towner. But on my 3rd day there, I heard it. I was marking trees near that section, running a bit late because we'd had equipment problems earlier. It started as these faint sounds, sounded like someone sobbing from the distance. As the sun got lower, it got louder, clearer. It was a young woman's voice, crying like her heart had been broken into. The sound seemed to move through the trees, never coming from quite the same place twice. The next day, I asked the crew about it. They were reluctant to talk at first, but eventually the oldest guy there told me the story. Apparently, back in the 30s, there had been a logging camp in that area. One of the loggers had a daughter, couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, who used to bring them their lunch every day. Story goes that one winter day she got lost in a sudden snowstorm. They searched for weeks but never found her body. That was eerie enough. But then he told me about the whispers. Said sometimes, if you're in that section of the woods alone, you'll hear a young girl's voice ask, "Are you going home?" Local legend says if you answer her, you too will become lost, no matter how well you know the woods. The crew had this strict rule. If you hear a voice asking about home, you keep your mouth shut, and you walk away fast as you can without running. Despite my hide-behind encounters, I didn't put much stock in that part of it. That seemed like your standard ghost story stuff. But I didn't doubt that the woods might be haunted, that a spirit might roam these parts. So I kept on my guard. The rain began to come down one afternoon, a huge downpour that kind of turned the ground to mud. The next morning, we found footprints all through our work site. Most were what you'd expect. Our own boot prints, deep and heavy, but mixed in with them were these other prints. Small, delicate, bare footprints that looked like they belonged to a teenage girl. They weren't just random either. They went right up to where each of us had been working, stood there, then moved on to the next spot. The really strange part was that these prints were on top of the ones we'd made the day before. Someone had walked through after we'd left. But they were just as rain-damaged as our old prints, like they'd been made during the storm and not after it. The local guys didn't seem surprised. They just walked the perimeter of the site, checking for any prints leading away. There weren't any. They just stopped at the edge of the clearing, like whoever made them simply vanished. That afternoon, I heard the crying again, but this time it sounded closer than before, more interested, if that makes sense, like it had taken notice. Around then, the crew chief called it a day, said the light was fading. It wasn't, but nobody argued. As we were packing up, I heard it, a small and gentle voice. Couldn't have been more than a few feet behind me. And I swear to you, I heard it say, "Are you going home?" It didn't sound menacing or scary, but lonely, even hopeful. And yet I jumped, had goosebumps all over my body, and every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and to say something back. But I remembered what the locals had said. I kept my mouth shut, gripping my chainsaw even tighter and walking to the truck without looking back. That was my last day on that job. I made up an excuse about a family emergency and broke my contract. Lost my bonus, but it seemed worth it. The crying forest, as I called it, wasn't aggressive like the hide-behind. It was sadder, more tragic somehow. But there was something about that gentle voice, about those delicate footprints in the mud, that got under my skin in a way the hide-behind never did. Maybe it was the idea that if you answered her, you might never be seen again. These days, I'm a lot more selective about the contracts I take. I ask around about the history of any site I'm considering working, and I've learned that every region has its own stories, its own spirits. The hide behind taught me to respect the territorial ones. The crying forest taught me that sometimes these sad ones are even more dangerous, because part of you wants to help them, even if it means getting lost yourself.
Story 2.
Glimmer Man by R. Daniels. I'm 43 years old and I've lived in the same modest house outside Taos, New Mexico for nearly 15 years. I purchased the property, 7 acres of pinon and juniper, back in 2009 when the housing market crashed. It was a foreclosure and I got it for a song. I've always been handy, so the fact that the place needed work didn't bother me. What sold me was the isolation and the views. From my back porch, I can see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, and at night the stars are so bright they cast shadows. I work as a mechanic at Cortez Auto, the only garage in the nearest town. The pay isn't great, but it's steady work and usually enough to cover my mortgage and bills. At least it was until about 6 months ago, when my mother's health took a turn. She's been living in an assisted living facility in Albuquerque for the past 5 years, but her Alzheimer's progressed to where she needed more specialized care. The new facility costs nearly twice as much. While my sister helps when she can, she's got 3 kids and her husband was laid off last year. I started looking for ways to make extra cash. I considered weekend shifts at the garage, but Frank, the owner, couldn't afford it. I thought about bartending. I did that in my 20s, but the nearest bar is a 45-minute drive, and with gas prices what they are, it hardly seemed worth it. That's when I remembered my land. 7 acres of trees, many mature and ready for harvest. Firewood sells well in northern New Mexico. The winters are cold, and many homes still rely on wood-burning stoves for heat. I did some research and found that a cord of pinon wood, which burns hot and smells wonderful, sells for around $300. If I could cut and split 2 cords a month, that would cover most of the increase in my mother's care costs. I already owned a decent chainsaw, a Stihl I'd used for clearing deadfall. I invested in a hydraulic log splitter used from a guy in Espanola and started working weekends. The routine was simple. Identify trees that were either dead or overcrowded, fell them, cut them into rounds, split the rounds into firewood, and stack it to season. Hard work, especially in the summer heat, but satisfying. I set up my operation about a quarter mile from my house, in a clearing where several trees had fallen during a spring windstorm. The spot was ideal, relatively flat with good access for my ATV and trailer to haul wood back to the stacking area near the driveway. I'd work from dawn until around noon when the heat became too intense, then resume in the late afternoon until dusk. The first month went well. I cut and split nearly 3 cords, sold 2 through Craigslist, and kept 1 for myself. The extra income helped, and the physical labor was a welcome distraction from worrying about my mother, whose good days were becoming increasingly rare. It was during the 2nd month, mid-July, when things changed. I remember the date precisely, July 17th. It was my mother's birthday. I'd visited her that morning before returning home to work. I arrived at my cutting site around 2 in the afternoon. The day was hot, over 95 degrees, but a monsoon was building to the west. I was in the middle of bucking a felled pinon into rounds when I first felt it, a prickling on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I stopped the chainsaw and looked around, expecting to see a deer, or maybe a neighbor out for a walk, though the nearest house is a mile away. I saw nothing, just the familiar landscape of scrubby trees and high desert brush. I dismissed the feeling and went back to work, but it persisted. By the time I finished cutting rounds and moved to the splitter, I found myself frequently pausing to scan my surroundings. Twice I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The sense of being observed was unnerving, but I reasoned it was probably just wildlife. The property hosts deer, coyotes, the occasional black bear, and once a mountain lion years ago. Any of these animals might watch a human from a distance. Still, animals typically make some sound, a snapping twig, rustling brush, and I heard nothing over the drone of my equipment. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened. The steady wind began to gust, causing trees to sway and creak. I decided to finish splitting the rounds I'd cut and pack up before the rain hit. It was during a lull in the wind, as I loaded split wood onto my trailer, that I heard it for the first time. Breathing. Not the panting of a dog or the snort of a deer, but the deep, measured breathing of something large. It seemed to come from beyond a stand of juniper about 30 feet away. I walked toward the sound, but it stopped. I found no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the hydraulic splitter cooling down. I finished loading the trailer and headed back to the house, but as I drove the ATV along the rough trail, I couldn't shake the feeling something was following me, just out of sight. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled through, dropping nearly an inch of rain in an hour. I sat on my covered porch watching lightning illuminate the mountains and listening to thunder shake the windows. Normally, I find storms exhilarating. That evening, I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for something. The next day was Sunday. Normally, I don't work Sundays, but the extra money was needed. The storm had cooled things down considerably. I returned to the cutting site around 9 in the morning. The ground was still damp from rain, which made for pleasant working conditions, but also meant any tracks would be visible. I took a few minutes to walk the perimeter of my work area. I found deer tracks, coyote prints, and numerous small bird and rodent marks, but nothing unusual. Still, as I fired up the chainsaw, the feeling of being observed returned, stronger than before. Throughout the morning, whenever the chainsaw fell silent, as I repositioned or took a water break, I would hear it, that same deep, rhythmic breathing. It seemed to come from different directions at different times, as if whatever was making the sound was circling me. By midday, I was on edge. I worked with one eye on the surrounding forest, the chainsaw held ready, not just as a tool, but as a weapon. Despite my vigilance, I saw nothing. I decided to take a lunch break back at the house, hoping that distance would clear my head. As I walked the quarter-mile trail, I distinctly heard footsteps behind me, not directly behind, but paralleling my path through the brush, about 20 yards to my right. When I stopped, they stopped. When I hurried, they kept pace. Back at the house, I ate quickly, then retrieved my binoculars and a hunting knife. I've never been a hunter, but I keep the knife for camping trips. Armed with these, I felt slightly more secure as I returned to the work site. The afternoon passed without incident, though the sensation of being watched never abated. This pattern continued for the next 5 days. Each day, I would work, and each day, the presence seemed to grow bolder. The breathing became louder, the footsteps less concealed. Twice, I saw branches move, brushed aside by some unseen force. By Friday, my nerves were frayed. I had begun carrying my phone in a chest pocket, recording everything while I worked, hoping to capture some evidence. But each evening, when I reviewed the recordings, I heard only the sounds of my equipment and the forest. That Friday afternoon, July 21st, was when everything escalated. The day was unusually still, with no wind to mask sounds. I had been working steadily since morning, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched, when my chainsaw sputtered and died, out of gas. In the sudden silence, the breathing was unmistakable, closer than ever before. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it, or rather, the absence of it. About 30 yards away, near a large juniper, there was a distortion in the air, like a heat shimmer above hot asphalt, but vertical and roughly human-shaped. It was as if the background was being bent around an invisible form. I froze, gas can in hand, staring at the phenomenon. It remained stationary for perhaps 10 seconds, then shifted, the distortion changing shape, as if whatever caused it had moved. I blinked, and in that instant, it vanished. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I quickly refueled the chainsaw, but my hands were shaking so badly I spilled gas on my boots. I wasn't going to stick around. I secured my equipment rapidly, not bothering to load the freshly split wood onto the trailer. The ATV was parked about 40 yards away at the edge of the clearing. I had just started walking toward it when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that crushed twigs and displaced gravel. I increased my pace, and the footsteps matched it. I began to jog, and they quickened. By the time I reached the ATV, I was running full speed. The footsteps were right behind me, so close I expected to feel a hand grab me. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, bent to retrieve them, and as I straightened, I felt something push me, hard, from behind. I pitched forward, landing face first in the dirt, the wind knocked out of me. I rolled over immediately, raising my arms to defend myself, but there was no follow-up attack. Instead, I heard those heavy footsteps rapidly retreating toward the cutting site. The sound was accompanied by that same deep breathing, now coming in faster, excited pants that gradually faded into the distance. I didn't wait. I started the ATV and rode back to the house as fast as the rough trail allowed, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced I would see that heat shimmer silhouette in pursuit. But nothing followed, at least nothing I could see. That was the end of my firewood operation. I haven't been back to that part of my property since. I sold the hydraulic splitter the following week and took out a small loan to cover the costs of my mother's care. Sometimes, especially on still days when the wind drops, I think I can hear breathing outside my house, but I've never again seen that distortion, or felt the presence of whatever was watching me.
Story 3.
Bigfoot is very strong from Bryson. This was back in October up in a remote area of the Olympic Peninsula. The timber company I work for had acquired rights to about acres of woods. They needed a full site assessment before bringing in any equipment, something that should take maybe or days to complete. I'm a land surveyor specializing in pre-logging assessments, and I would be the one to survey this area. I had started that morning doing the perimeter work, marking boundaries and checking access points. The weather report mentioned a chance of rain, but that's nothing unusual there. Around noon, I moved into the interior section to start assessing tree density and ground conditions. The clouds were starting to roll in, but visibility was still decent enough to work. I should mention here that I'm used to working alone. Actually, I prefer it most of the time. Lets me focus on the technical aspects without having to make conversation. This kind of job leads you to encountering wildlife plenty. Bears, cougars, you name it. I've even seen some wolves. You learn to stay aware of your surroundings while getting the job done. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got when I reached the central portion of the site. Usually, there's constant background noise in these forests, what with the birds and small animals and wind in the trees. But here it was silent, just the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I kept working through, marking trees and taking measurements. I had a job to do. It started raining lightly around then, just a drizzle really, barely enough to need a rain jacket. I was measuring the diameter of a very large Douglas fir when I heard it. There was a heavy rustling sound, like something big moving through the trees. Bears make noise when they move. Yeah, but this was different than that. Seemed even bigger. At first, I grabbed my bear spray, got it ready, and kept on working, keeping an eye on where the sound had come from. But then I saw the movement through the trees, maybe yards out. Something very big was moving, and I'm not talking bear. Massive. This thing had to be at least FT tall, probably weighing twice that of a full-grown man. The vegetation was too thick to see it clearly, but I could see branches and small trees moving as it passed. I watched it for maybe seconds, trying to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Then it stopped moving. Complete and perfect stillness. The rain was picking up now, and I could hear drops hitting the leaves overhead. And then something else started. The thing out there, whatever it was, began to break branches. Not little ones either. Branches thicker than my arm, snapping them like twigs. The sound echoed through the forest. Crack, crack, crack. Then it started to shake entire trees, young hemlocks, probably FT tall, bending and thrashing them like they were caught in a hurricane, except there was hardly any wind. I'll be honest here. I began to back away at this point, terrified. A life of experience with the wilderness was screaming at me that this was not natural. I kept my eyes on the area where the disturbance was happening while trying to make my way back toward the access road. That's when I heard the footsteps. Each step was like a small impact, making the ground vibrate slightly. They were following my path of retreat but staying just out of clear sight in the thicker brush. The rain was steady now, reducing visibility even further. But I could see trees swinging as it moved past them. The footsteps were getting faster. I picked up my pace, still trying not to run. Running from predators is said to be the worst thing you can do. I had my GPS unit out, making sure I was heading the right way toward the road. The thing was paralleling my course, moving through the woods about yards to my right. Every few steps it would snap another branch or shake another tree, like it was reminding me it was there. Then I heard this sound, hard to describe, like a grunt but extremely deep and way loud. It seemed to resonate in my chest. That's when a branch came flying at me. It was more like a small tree trunk, really, about in thick and maybe FT long. It came crashing through the canopy and hit the ground only FT in front of me, spraying mud and debris everywhere. I started running then. I abandoned all the usual wilderness safety protocols and just ran flat out toward where I knew the road had to be. The footsteps behind got faster too, and heavier. Trees were crashing and swaying all around me. Another branch flew past, this one just missing my head. I don't remember much about the last part of that run. Pure adrenaline was really taking me over. I remember the rain got harder, the sound of footsteps getting closer, more branches and debris flying through the air. Then suddenly I was on an access road. The footsteps stopped right at the tree line. In my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as quickly as I could. In the rear view, I could see trees still swaying at the edge of the forest, even though the wind was not that strong. Now came the hard part, writing up my report. I couldn't exactly put giant unknown creature displaying territorial aggression in an official survey document, but I also couldn't in good conscience recommend the site for logging operations. Someone could get killed out there. Heck, I nearly was. In the end, I cited several legitimate concerns that would make the site unsuitable for logging. Unstable ground conditions, hazardous tree conditions, evidence of significant large predator activity, limited emergency access. I also strongly recommended that any future survey work be conducted by teams of at least 3, citing that the remote location and potential hazards were reason for such. The timber company wasn't happy. They'd paid good money for those logging rights, but my reputation for thorough and accurate assessments helped. They accepted my recommendations and decided to look for an alternative site. A few months after this happened, I was at Walmart of all places. I ran into an old indigenous man. He asked me about some wine recommendations, and before long we started to talk. We got into what I do for a living, and I admitted a part of my experience, enough to say that I encountered something strange, but not enough to make me sound insane. He smiled, and he told me that some places aren't meant to be cut down. He explained that his people had known for generations that certain parts of the forest had these guardians, powerful spirits that protected the old trees. He wouldn't say any more about it, but he didn't seem surprised by my questions. Afterward, I have been back to that general area since then, but never to that specific site, and I've never had any other strange phenomena happen.
Story 4.
Crazy old Kenny, Walter D. This may be the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. A few months after my open heart surgery, I was cleared to return to work. Honestly, I wasn't sure this would ever happen again. I mean, heart surgery is a big deal, and it was a scary experience. But this time, I made it through, and I'm glad it didn't lead to another heart attack. I was one of 2 equipment technicians sent to investigate a series of machinery failures at a logging operation in northern Maine. This site had been dealing with a strange number of equipment malfunctions that didn't make sense given the age and maintenance of the machines. From what I recall, chainsaws had been jamming for no apparent reason, new ones at that. Skidders were losing pressure despite pristine hydraulic systems. The most serious case was when a harvester almost killed one of the operators when its brakes failed. The harvester incident was troubling. The operator had been moving a load of logs down a slight grade when the brakes suddenly failed. He crashed into a dirt berm instead of going over a steep embankment. That had been too close. The other tech with me was Victor. He specialized in smaller machinery and safety systems, with a background in industrial accident investigation. Our bosses thought his experience might help given the nature of these failures. We were flown in, and the logging site was remote, tucked away in woods that hadn't seen much activity before. The access road was barely more than a logging trail. It was the kind of place where you could work for weeks and never see anyone else except the crew. When we arrived, the foreman gave us access to all the maintenance records and incident reports, plus a small trailer to use as our workspace and sleeping quarters. The operation was running 2 shifts, trying to make up for lost time due to all the equipment issues. Everything seemed okay at first, just the usual wear and tear you'd expect. The reports were detailed and regular. The equipment was new, and the crew seemed competent. But once we started doing detailed inspections, things didn't add up. The failures didn't seem random. They were precise and targeted, showing intimate knowledge of each machine's weaknesses. We found parts missing in ways that couldn't happen by accident. These parts had been deliberately removed from secondary systems that would only fail under specific conditions. Hydraulic lines had clean cuts, perfectly placed to cause catastrophic failures, but only when the machines were under maximum stress. Safety mechanisms had been subtly altered to fail in crucial moments, and backup systems had been disabled in ways that only became apparent during emergencies. Someone who knew machinery inside and out was behind all of this. Not just how machines worked, but how they failed. This wasn't just sabotage. These were setups for accidents that looked like mechanical failures on the surface. It wasn't until we dug deeper that we saw the deliberate nature of the damage. Whoever was doing this was targeting systems that wouldn't be checked regularly, as long as everything seemed fine. When we presented our findings to the foreman, in his office, a converted shipping container that smelled of coffee and wet wool, his face went pale. He insisted none of his crew would do anything like this. They were all experienced professionals, he said, and knew how dangerous sabotage could be. But I noticed some of the older loggers exchanging uncomfortable glances. One of them, an old guy who had been quietly maintaining his chainsaw in the corner, seemed especially uneasy. It took some careful questioning over the next few days, but eventually, one of the veterans, a chainsaw operator named Gus, pulled us aside. He was a seasoned logger, the kind who'd been working the woods since before many of the safety systems we were investigating had even been invented. He told us about someone named Kenny Boone. Kenny had worked at the site until a few months ago when he was fired after a violent incident. He had been the lead equipment mechanic, brilliant with machines but becoming increasingly unstable. He was accused of stealing fuel, a serious offense on a remote site. Instead of defending himself, he attacked his supervisor with a tire iron. The supervisor needed stitches and still walked with a limp. When security tried to remove him, Kenny refused to leave by road. Instead, he grabbed his pack and a hatchet from his truck and disappeared into the woods, screaming that they would regret it. They searched for him, of course. The forest was dense, full of ravines and thick underbrush. It's not the kind of place you'd want to survive without proper supplies. After a few days, they assumed he either found his way to civilization or succumbed to the elements. But it seemed those assumptions were wrong. That night, Victor and I started noticing strange things. We heard movement in the trees near camp. These sounds followed patterns, like someone was trying to sneakily watch us. One early morning around 3 a.m., Victor woke me up, swearing he could hear someone breathing outside the trailer. We checked, but the ground didn't seem disturbed. No footprints. No sign anyone was there. The next morning changed everything. We had been checking one of the damaged skidders, and the ground was still soft from overnight dew. We went back to the trailer to grab specialized tools, and when we returned minutes later, there were fresh boot prints circling the machine, deep impressions in the mud. Strangely, these prints didn't match any of the loggers' boots. In fact, they looked mismatched, like someone was wearing different boots entirely. They hadn't been there just minutes ago. Someone had been waiting for us to leave and deliberately let us know they were watching. The morning after that, all our tools were gone. Every piece of equipment we'd brought to diagnose and repair the machines had vanished overnight. The only thing left behind was a hatchet buried deep in a tree trunk near the edge of camp. The blade was half rusted, and the handle was wrapped in old tape, darkened by sweat and grime. Gus looked at it and went pale. He confirmed it was Kenny's hatchet, the same one he had taken into the woods months ago. The message was clear. Kenny Boone wasn't dead. He had been surviving in the wilderness, watching the logging operation, learning their patterns, and messing with them in dangerous ways. He'd probably been living off whatever he could scrounge or steal from the camp, staying just out of sight in the dense woods he now knew better than anyone else. The hatchet was more than proof he was alive. It was a threat. And now that we were there to fix the machines, we were messing with his plans. He wanted them to fail. He wanted to shut down the operation. We reported everything to the police that night. But that same night, around midnight, we all heard it. A chainsaw revving somewhere deep in the woods, running full throttle but never cutting anything. It was just screaming into the darkness. In all my years working in logging, that was the scariest sound I'd ever heard. Something so common, but coming from the dark, from a man who might want us all dead. Victor and I packed up our remaining gear that night. A job wasn't worth being attacked by a maniac. We left first thing in the morning. I later found out they shut down the site within a month after too many continuing accidents and equipment failures. They wrote it off as a loss and moved elsewhere. The only thing left behind was apparently Kenny Boone's hatchet. The police they called never found him, and no one wanted to touch the thing. That's the end of my experience, but it left me with mental scars. Whenever I hear a chainsaw rev up now, my mind quickly jumps to Kenny Boone. For just a moment, I think about that night in the woods when Kenny reminded us that some men don't need ghosts or monsters to haunt a forest. They just need time, knowledge, and enough hatred to survive on.
Story 5.
When I was 10 years old, my grandfather Thad first told me about this ghost story. It was about a phantom lumberjack. I remember it was during one of our weekend fishing trips, just the two of us sitting in an old wooden boat as the sun went down. I had been pestering him all day to tell me more stories about his old lumberjack days. He worked in the industry for almost all his life before retiring, and I was fascinated by his tales of massive trees and dangerous work, and my favorite, the folklore surrounding it. Usually, his stories were adventurous and even funny, but that evening, I got something different. He spoke in a quieter voice than he usually did when telling these stories. The story he told me haunted me for years, and even now, decades later, I sometimes lie awake thinking about it. Now, I don't know how much of this is true, but it's definitely scary, and my grandfather claimed it was nothing but fact. It happened when he was working as a crew supervisor at a remote logging site. He never told me exactly where it was, said it was better if people didn't know the exact location because that was safer. The crew was small, just about 8 men. According to my grandfather, some very creepy things began the first week there. There were marks across the site, deep cuts in trees too clean and purposeful to be animals, often too high up to have been made by anyone standing on the ground. Some of the guys there swore they looked like symbols of some sort. Some said they were old loggers' marks, ways that old-time timber crews might claim their territory or mark certain trees. But my grandfather had been in the industry for years by then, and had never seen anything like them. One of his men, I think he said, was Clarence, was particularly disturbed by the marks. He was from that area originally, and told my grandfather a story his father had told him about something that happened in those woods back in 1880. Buckle up. A story within a story within a story. According to Clarence, there had been a logger named Aldrin Pite who'd worked these same forests. Aldrin had been obsessed with claiming the biggest trees for himself, marking them with his own symbols that he would carve into the bark. The story went that one winter, after a very bitter dispute about territory with other logging crews, Aldrin had gone out alone to mark his trees. When he didn't come back, they assumed he'd gotten lost and taken by the elements. Days later, they found his body, or what was left of it. He'd been crushed between 2 massive logs, his own marking axe buried in his chest. How that happened, no one knew. My grandfather at the time did not believe such a story. Even so, things kept happening that he could not explain. They returned to the work sites in the morning to find trees that were marked for cutting, but had become unmarked. Their blazes scraped clean off the bark. One morning they found chainsaw chains torn from the chainsaws themselves and hung up around the campsite. On other occasions they heard whistling. It would start as a faint sound, echoing through the trees well into the late afternoon. These weren't like bird calls or even wind. It was clearly someone whistling an old timber working song, the kind old logging crews would sing while working. But it might come from different directions, moving through the forest faster than a person could walk, or sometimes coming from up in the canopy. The crew started noticing other things too. There were sightings of a man in old-fashioned logging gear walking around the woods. When someone might attempt to run up and ask what he was doing, he would disappear behind a tree and just vanish. One of the younger guys swore he saw something one evening while marking trees. He described it as a man wearing the kind of clothes loggers wore back in the early 1900s. You know, suspenders, heavy wool shirt, cork boots. But the man was impossibly tall. He said his face was just wrong somehow, but Grandpa didn't remember the details. When the younger worker called out to the man, the figure turned slightly, and that's when he realized he could see straight through the man to the trees beyond. My grandfather had quite the task. He tried to keep the crew calm despite all the strange happenings, trying to get them to focus on their work. But then, he couldn't explain what happened to a guy named Whitfield. Whitfield was their most experienced feller. He'd been cutting trees for years without any serious accidents. He was working alone one afternoon, which wasn't unusual back then, when the rest of the crew heard him scream. They found his body about 20 yards from where he'd been working. At first, they thought a tree had kicked back wrong and hit him, but there were no fallen trees nearby, no sign of that happening, and his head, well, my grandfather didn't like talking about that part. Just said it had been removed with a single clean cut, like it had been done with some kind of blade. They never did find his head. The official report said it was an equipment accident, but my grandfather knew better. He'd seen the marks where they found Whitfield, the same strange symbols they'd been finding on the bark. The site was forced to shut down after that. My grandfather, before leaving for the final time, had to pick up some things from the supervisor's cabin, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing among the trees, tall as a young fir, wearing clothes from another century. In one hand, it held an axe, and in the other, something round that my father didn't want to look at too closely. The figure didn't move, didn't try to approach, just stood there watching. My grandpa said he had never felt so scared. After telling me the story, he reached into his tackle box and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. It was a small piece of bark with a strange symbol carved into it. He said he took it from one of the trees that day. He said he wanted to remind himself that the things he saw were real, but by God, I hope he's lying. Do you think after you get your head removed from your body like that, you keep seeing and thinking about things? If so, for how long? That's such a disturbing thought. I wonder how many people that happen to just think, wow, this sucks, and my head would be itchy right when this happens. Well, that brings us to the end.
Story 6.
All became still. Dear Mr. James Holger, in 3 days' time from this letter arriving, you will receive an invitation. It will be from your old friend Walter Coven. It will talk of a party that you will be the guest of honor for. Go to it and kill Mr. Coven. We hoped that he would never discover the secrets of his family's history, but to the detriment of all mankind he has. The box of bullets that came with this letter are for your Webley revolver. They are special, as they are encased within a layer of sap. The sap came from a tree that is one of a kind, one that could only grow over a dead priest's grave. Use that ammo on Walter. Kill him before it's too late. If all works out as we think it will, we will contact you again soon. From a man who knows much. James awoke in a chair that was behind a large wooden desk. His vision was blurry, not knowing where he was for a moment. Stacks of papers covered most of the top of it. His Webley revolver was on the stack that was closest to him. A thick string went from its handle and had been looped around his belt. An old habit he's had since he fought the Germans in the Great War. His leather jacket hung on a coat rack next to the door of the dimly lit room. His white undershirt looked to have blood on it and was soaked through with sweat. His black pants had stains on them as well, looking to be more blood or some wine. His long hair was a mess, too. He reached into his pocket to grab his watch. It wasn't there for some reason, having no idea where it could even be. James stumbled to a clock that stood on the far side of the study. The room was dark. Boards creaked under his boots with every step. Heavy rain could be heard outside, rain pelting the large stained glass windows of the study. Lightning flashed for a moment before it dissipated back into the darkness. The lights flickered, or just stopped working completely for a few seconds at a time. Once he got to it, he read what it said. 11:40 p.m. He needed to get out. Now. Once midnight strikes, once this clock rings out that a new day has come, he's dead, along with everybody else in the town below. James checked how much ammo he had remaining for his revolver that wasn't already loaded. 12 rounds, all blessed with the holy sap that came from a tree. He didn't know how that stuff worked. From what he had seen Walter do these past couple days, it didn't matter. His old friend needed to die. James had hoped, though, that he could have reasoned with him, that he could have had him stop the ritual, to have him revert from the monster he was slowly becoming. What he had seen was nothing short of supernatural. Everybody else was dead besides him and that creature now. This manor that sat atop the hill above the small town of Bromer was soon to be his tomb. He had to focus down the paths, remember where he had been before. Something was in the wine Walter had given to him, to all of them. He barely remembered 5 minutes ago, let alone when he had first arrived 2 days prior. Bits and pieces were all he could think of, like fragments of a mirror that had been shattered, with most of the pieces being lost to him. The concoction he had been given, though, is slowly wearing off. Minute by minute, he is able to remember more and more of what had occurred. Just when James thought his luck wasn't able to get any worse, the lights went out completely. He had heard a pop before all of the lights exploded in their sockets, making him duck for cover from all their shrapnel. "You are the last, James. An outcome I had hoped for," said Walter, voice booming down the halls at James, shaking the very manor itself. James didn't need to respond. He tried pleading with Walter earlier in the day. Now he had to kill him before the clock struck 12. The walls shook for a split second before Walter's voice reached him again. "The others had to die. They had to become the key for a door that is deep within the stone of this place. James, that is where I'll be waiting." Always speaking in fucking riddles, James thought to himself. I should have seen what he was sooner. He thought back to when he had first gotten here. Walter looked normal. Bright blue eyes, dirty blonde hair with perfect posture, pale skin, and a scar that was below his left eye from the shrapnel he had gotten during the Great War. But as the people began to disappear or were found to be brutally murdered, he slowly changed. At first it was subtle. James was the only one that noticed because he knew him so well. His skin began to look clammy. Veins started to appear slightly around his eyes and on his neck. Subtle but noticeable once enough people died. A pungent smell of rotten meat came from a doorway ahead. Light emanated from the opening. James got to the doorway and stared at what was beyond. His stomach began to rush to his throat, holding it down. The room looked to be a guest bedroom of sorts. A large bed on the far side of the room. Framed paintings decorated the walls. In the middle, a pile of corpses were neatly stacked. The 10 bodies surrounded a stone altar that looked to be ancient. It was shaped to look like a branchless tree, having a pair of stone hands that reached out the top of it straight up. Bits of it were weathered or had been chipped away over the years. It was covered in dried blood. Candles circled the bodies about 5 feet out from the base of the pile. Fog rolled from the candles inward towards the bodies, distorting symbols that had been drawn on the ground in that area with blood. Heat radiated from the room, adding to the nausea James felt. Atop the blood-stained altar was something familiar. It was a pocket watch that floated in the air above the bloodied stone. It was his that he lost, hearing the hands of it moving as they ticked away somehow. He stepped toward the altar carefully. The fog moved away from his feet with every step once he got past the candles. The thin line of space between it and his boots revealed more of the symbols that were within its haze. James glanced at the bodies. Hard to tell who was who because of their conditions. Something, though, was consistent. They looked like husks, like they had been dead for years already. Their blood was drained. He just knew it. He saw what Walter had done to their friend Michael last night, the one who survived the longest with James. All of the body's skin looked more like leather as it tightened around their bones, drained of all moisture of any kind. Once he got close enough, he reached for the watch that floated in midair. It snapped into his hands, drawn in by his outward grasp. James looked at the time, 11:43 p.m. The watch brought back his memories of the last few days, no longer distorted, no longer impeded by the concoction that Walter had given him. He knew where he was in this place, within a barrel that once held joyful spirits. He heard Walter's voice say, "Shall you find the entrance to a place deemed divine?" The wine cellar. James hurried out of the room. The place seemed brighter now to him as he ran. The storm outside raged. Flashes of lightning lit the halls as he rushed through them. They seemed to strike more frequently the closer he got to the kitchen. The kitchen, he remembered the layout well, as it was the first place somebody had been murdered. It was Walter's girlfriend, Samantha. Her head had been hacked off with a cleaver, and her body had been drained of blood before anybody even found her. A good cover for Walter. Killing her first would make it harder for the others to suspect that he had done it. Once James had gotten to the entrance, he aimed his revolver forward, stepping into the room. It felt warm with a smell of stagnant water, like he had just walked into a swamp. The muggy air stuck to his skin, making him start to sweat after just a few moments. He looked at the door that was next to the stove on the right side of the room. He went through it, looking at the void that was the staircase just past it. He looked at his watch, which he could somehow see clearly in the blackness. 11:46 p.m. He had to move. He stepped down the steps as fast he could, almost slipping as they became more slick the farther he got down them. A string of lights that somehow still had power were lit across the ceiling, going from one end to the other. A huge barrel that James could sleep in comfortably if he wanted to was open. The muggy air flowed from it as he could see an opening on the far side, like a tunnel. He hunched over on all fours to crawl through the opening. The tunnel was like a portal that led to the past. The room beyond was much older. Clumps of moss layered the stone brick walls. Spots that you could put torches in were mounted on them. The ceiling was natural stone, like the rest had been carved out and designed to look like bricks at some point. The floor had a brick design as well. James almost slipped and fell as he took his first steps on the stony floor. The ground was slick, very slick. The path led deeper into the earth. He had to keep going. Each step he took echoed down the tunnel, making it obvious that he was going down it from a mile away. The watch he had gotten started to glow in his pocket. Once he took it out, it became a ball of white light. He could hear the hands tick away. Even those echoed in this ancient path. He looked at the time, 11:50 p.m. "Enter, friend, to see what has become of me, what shall soon become of all," he heard Walter say from deeper within the path. This time, though, his voice seemed much more human, not like the monster he had now become. After a couple of minutes of walking, James could see a turn in the tunnel ahead. He went to the corner to peek around it. What lay beyond was a stone door that was left ajar. A distinct bloody handprint could be seen in the middle of it. He rounded the corner, heading towards it. He wished he had more time to look over this place, because even the door was a sight to see. The light he held revealed the intricate carvings that were on it. He glanced at it while he carefully pushed the door open. It depicted a man in the center with what looked to be 9 mummified bodies surrounding it. 11:53 p.m. He stopped in his tracks, now beyond the doorway. A red light came from another opening about 50 feet ahead of him. The light dimmed, then became bright again over and over, pulsing as it was accompanied by a droning hum. At its brightest, it heated the hallway he stood in extremely. Blood ran down the walls and dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the flat floor somehow, then forming into red mounds as they collected more and more blood. Streams of steam rose from them. James could feel their heat as it irradiated through his boots while he tried to avoid them. 11:56 p.m. James walked through the light, revealing Walter as he floated in the middle of a room. 9 bodies were on the floor around him, wrapped in black and gold cloth. Thorned wreaths lay upon their heads. Lit candles surrounded the bodies as well. At 4 evenly spaced spots around the large circle of bodies, 4 of those stone altars James had seen before stood. These ones, though, seemed to be carved from the ground itself. The originals, it seemed, as the one upstairs looked to be a mere imitation of these 4. They were also much larger, almost the same height as Walter as he floated in the air. The red light came from them, along with the blistering heat. The walls were pitch black, no light reflected off of them. They looked to be carved out of a black crystal of some kind. He looked at Walter, who faced away from him as he remained in the air. His arms were held straight out to the sides, palms faced up, with steaming blood dripping from them. When the blood hit the ground, symbols would form from the drops, then move to a random spot within the circle. He wore a black robe. His head then snapped to the side, now looking towards James. "Hello, James," said Walter. "I'm glad you came to see what shall soon be done." His eyes were a dark red, thick veins protruding from around the sockets. His smile was horrid as his teeth were black. His lips were a pale pink, and his complexion was akin to a corpse. His voice seemed twisted somehow, like something else spoke within him. "You've already done enough, Walter," said James. He gripped his revolver tight, then aimed it at the creature that floated before him. As soon as he had, though, the bullets within the cylinder began to glow. The gun became warm in his hand, but no sense of danger crossed his mind. Only peace. A cold breeze somehow washed over him. Leaves shook in a breeze somewhere far away. It was the ammunition somehow. James looked at the gun as he saw them glow as well. "You think a gun can stop me?" He laughed. "You think it can stop what is to come?" "I only answer to the oldest of this world, James, for I am his scribe. Look upon my work, and fear what is soon to come. A new dawn shall soon rise for all." 11:58 p.m. The revolver now shook within James's hand. The room became a blur besides Walter himself down the sights. The heat dissipated along with everything else. Focus, pure focus, took him. He stood there for a moment. 11:59 p.m. A shot rang out. The bullet had hit the dead center of the man's chest. From the newly made hole, a beam of white light came from deep within. Walter screamed. The other voice from within faded from the tones, until all that remained was Walter himself. He then collapsed to the ground. The red glow from the altars faded. A gust of wind blew from the entrance of the room, snuffing out all of the candles. The only source of light now was James's watch, which now floated on its own above his head. James looked at his friend's corpse, then cocking the revolver's hammer back, shot another round into the body, then another, and another until the cylinder was spent. Small beams of light came from each new wound. All became still as the new day came.